Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this session, this webinar. We will be, I suppose, for the next 45 minutes, covering a lot of details around setting up your company ESOP and what you need to know. Just a few housekeeping issues to start with and a few introductions. So we will send out the recording link over the next couple of days and be able to share that. So if you're not able to stay for the whole session, then look out for that and obviously let us know if you've got any questions. In terms of quick introductions, I am David from Orchestra. I've got my colleague Keegan next to me from Orchestra as well. And it's my pleasure really to introduce Georgina from Legal Vision. Georgina, did you want to do a quick intro for yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dave. So I am a practice group leader with our corporate team in Legal Vision and head up our New Zealand legal practice. And Legal Vision is, a relatively new concept in New Zealand, certainly, that we offer legal services to businesses basically on a subscription model. So have been working with Orchestra for a year or so now, which has been great.
Excellent. And so Georgina will mention a little bit around the services they offer at the end of the webinar and offer as well for attendees to the webinar. So look out for that. Just in terms of a quick general disclaimer, I suppose, from an Orchestra side, this presentation is intended as general information only. So we don't offer financial products or legal or tax advice. But if you are after that, then that's what Georgina is here for. So you're welcome to reach out and book a specific session with her to cover what your company requirements are around legal advice. And we do have some tax partners as well that can provide some specialist advice. So let us know and we can put you in touch with those partners also. So I will pass over to Keegan to kick in with a little bit of an introduction on ESOPs. And then we'll go through some key decisions that you need to make when setting up your company ESOP.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dave. I'm just going to share my screen and bring up a wee bit of a slideshow. So a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be covering today. First off, a bit of an intro to ESOPs. So we did another webinar on this previously. So if you are new to ESOPs, then I'd recommend getting your hands on that because we do dig into the details quite a bit. And for today's webinar, we will really just be scratching the surface on that. And then following on from that, we'll talk a little bit about what the process is and how it relates to options and specifically to call options. There are lots of different ESOPs and we're going to focus in on call options today. And then we'll move through, and this is where I'll bring Georgina in because she's the expert. We'll move through and start talking about some of the key decisions that a company has to make when they're deciding on setting up an ESOP. So that'll really be the meat of today's webinar. There's some good topics in there that we can cover off. Following that, we can have a little bit of a conversation around how best to manage ESOPs because they can be a little bit burdensome in terms of management. And I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions. There always is. And we'll carve out some time towards the end of today's session for that. And then, of course, time permitting, we can have a little bit of a look at Orchestra itself and how it does help companies to manage their ESOPs from A to Z.
Just on questions, there is a box at the bottom of your screen there to ask a question. So either during the presentation, if you think of a question, pop that in there, or obviously during the Q&A at the end, and we'll cover those, make sure we've got a bit of time to do those towards the end.
Cool. So what are ESOPs? So ESOPs, that's an abbreviation for employee share ownership plans. There are lots of different abbreviations, which can be a little bit complicating. Over in the US, they call these employee stock option plans. Obviously, a little bit different to what we have here in New Zealand and in Australia as well. But for all intents and purposes for today, we're going to be talking about employee share ownership plans. And we use that generic term ownership rather than options because it covers off more than just option plans. There's also loan to purchase schemes and phantom share schemes as well. So broadly speaking, ESOPs, they allow a pathway to ownership for employees. So they allow employees to receive shares in their company and become a part owner. They have been designed to encourage and incentivize ownership mentality to align company goals, and they're very, very effective in doing so when they're done right, would be the caveat there. So generally, businesses will offer to either give or sell options or shares to their employees, and you can set that up to be factored into either KPIs or performance objectives for both the company and individual too. So there's lots of flexibility on how you might arrange that. Now, what is the ESOP process? So this, as a side note, relates directly to options. So not so applicable to loan to purchase schemes, not so applicable to phantom share schemes, but for call options, there's three main steps. The first one is the granting of options. So we've made a new hire. We're going to give this new person that we're bringing into the team 1,000 options. That's the grant. You're allocating share options to your employee. And then once you've allocated those options, then the next step would be to have those options vest. So vesting effectively is earning the right to something. So you've given your employee 1,000 options. That's part of the grant. And over the next 4 years, they will have those options vest. So say 250 a year. Now, those options cannot be exercised until they have been vested. So it's important to set that up in a way that aligns with what your company is trying to achieve. Now, once those share options have in fact vested, then the employee has the option to exercise them. And that's the process where the employee will pay the exercise price, and we'll talk a little bit about that shortly. But they'll pay the exercise price, and that share option will be converted into a formal share. And that's when those employees, they become formal shareholders and they're treated as such. So you purchase those shares at the predetermined exercise price agreed in the initial grant. So that's a little bit about the process on how it works. And if we dig straight into it, and I'll bring you in on this, Georgina. So we talk to a lot of companies about what they're trying to achieve when they set up an employee share scheme or an ESOP. And I think probably the first thing that you ask a company would be, well, what are you trying to achieve? Why are you setting an ESOP up? What are the objectives? And I would say one of the most important things to consider as the person who is setting an ESOP up is what your end goal is. So as a company, are you looking for a quick exit? You want to scale very quickly and then be acquired or merged? Or are you looking to grow the business to a point where it's highly profitable and then hand it down to your kids? I say that tongue in cheek, but what are the ultimate objectives for the ESOP? And based on your answer there, then obviously there are different models of ESOP which would suit your company best. Is there anything that you would add to that, Georgina?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very company specific. ESOPs are appropriate, across the board for all sorts of companies, whether you are a high growth startup or whether you're a more established company. But all the things that you're talking about, Keegan, go to how we actually structure it for you to make sure that we're pulling the right levers to have the impact that you want to have with your ESOP. Obviously, from a company perspective, the ESOPs, regardless of where you're at on that spectrum, it's a really great way to attract and retain really good talent. For startups in particular, they can be really attractive because obviously, typically you've got lower cash reserves available to you to attract some of those key employees. And you do feel some pressure in that regard. So it does provide you a bit more flexibility to structure your REM packages effectively. So you can have that lower cash-based salary and then added on to that, you can then, have an attractive arrangement where that employee does have some future ownership of the business. On the flip side of that, then the employees are sitting there saying, I've got skin in the game now. I can benefit from ownership in the company. And that will typically lead to things like, increased productivity, higher retention, basically has an impact on the overall success of the business in terms of increased sales and profitability. The one kind of caveat I would add to that is to make sure that you do benefit from all of those things. From a company perspective, you really need to make sure that your employees understand what they're signing up for. So they need to really understand how the plan operates so that they can then appreciate and value what they're receiving. So, high communication, clear, effective communication is actually really key to putting these in place.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I think you've touched on something really important, and that's the education piece. Too many times have we seen a company set out with the best of intentions, and through lack of education, there is a slight misunderstanding with the employees, which can just be addressed very early on to make sure that everyone's aligned and they understand what the advantage of being part of an ESOP is. I couldn't agree more with that point. And so we've discussed what our objectives are for setting up the ESOP as a company, and what we hope to achieve. Now, in your experience, who would be owning the actual setup process? I mean, are you having CEOs, founders, CFOs, HR managers? I mean, who's setting this up initially, and then once it has been set up, who's owning the management of it? Because it can be quite hands-on.
Yeah, sure. So I can definitely, particularly talk to the setup side, which is where typically we are most involved in. So normally you'd see the founders taking a lead role here. In larger, more established companies, then you'll also have the CFO and the CEO typically involved as well. The reason it's those people is that they understand what those key objectives of the scheme are. They understand particular drivers around their business and their employees, and they also have the most to gain in terms of, incentivizing good performance and attracting really good employees. So in essence, they effectively know which levers they need to pull for their particular situation to incentivize the employees in the way that they want to. In terms of the ongoing management, Keegan, I think you can probably provide a bit more context on that front, given your experience with your Orchestra customers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it very much depends, to your point as well, where the company is sitting in terms of their life cycle. So what we see is very early stage companies, startups, they will, for the most part, have their founders managing the ESOP, which is, I'm sure there's plenty of founders who are joining in the conversation today. There's not enough time in the day for you guys. And sitting in front of an Excel spreadsheet isn't exactly the most appealing way to spend your time. So usually when you have a founder or that early stage company who's looking after the ESOP, they want a tool to be able to manage it. And then as the company progresses and gets slightly larger, that's usually when we would see either the CFO or the HR manager take that over, and that depends usually on the size of the ESOP and the size of the company. So if the company does have an HR manager, then I would suggest that they're the one in charge of this because they have a good understanding of the employee's remuneration. And that I think brings us to the next point quite well, and that's how much of the company equity are we going to carve out? And there's a little bit of an example on the right-hand side. We have seen it vary wildly. I have personally. I've seen companies set aside 2%, and I've seen companies set aside 40%. So it does come down very much to the individual company's appetite. I would say probably somewhere in the realms of 10 to 15% would be standard. Would you agree with that, Georgina?
Yeah, absolutely. 10 to 20% is usually what we see, and usually what we recommend as well, unless the founders have got a particular reason to go a lot lower than that, or again a lot higher, which is typically because they've got strong succession plans in place. The key thing to note there, I guess, in that table talks to that as well, is that normally during a cap raising round, you'll find that you've got a lead investor that will actually push for the ESOP to be topped up. And the reason they do that is they want to make sure that there's continued headroom to keep attracting and retaining talent in that company that they're obviously investing in. And while the existing ESOP holders, again, this goes to the communication piece, while they effectively get diluted down as a result of that top up, it's important to note that their overall value of the company has increased as a result of the raise. And so while their percentage holding has been diluted, the value of that holding itself has actually been increased. So again, it's a real communication thing. And the company itself just needs to make sure it's leaving enough headroom between each funding round then to continue using that pool in a way that's most effective for it.
I think further to that as well, one thing that one nuance of ESOP is, I guess the way that I would put it, is that usually you might say hypothetically set aside 10% of the company's equity, but in that first round of issuing ESOP, you might not have that full 10% that has been issued out be subsequently vested. So there's two reasons for that. The first one might be, well, actually, after 2 years, an employee may leave for whatever reason. And so, 50% of their ESOP allocation will never be vested. And so it's recycled back into the original pool in most cases. And then the second point would be, well, what happens if an employee or a company doesn't meet an objective or KPI, which the company has predefined as vesting criteria as well? Well, then obviously those options wouldn't vest, and so they would go back to the original pool. So I guess the reason I mention that is, even though you're setting aside, say, 10% of the company, you may not always have that full amount vest. Now, I think one of the things probably that I get asked the most, and it is a very good question, is, well, and there's different schools of thought on this. Who will the ESOP apply to? So what would you see as being the most common, George?
Yeah, sure. So, we obviously loosely use the word employee share option scheme all the time, but it doesn't necessarily just limit you to employees. Yeah. So obviously that's your key target market. But then it can be used for a whole range of service providers. So we'd see contractors being brought on, directors and advisors are usually sort of the three main categories that we see. The main requirement from a legal perspective is just that it needs to be, if it's not an employee, it's someone who's providing personal services mainly to the company. So provided you're fitting within that band, then you're fine.
Yeah, that's a really good point to make. And this next question I'm going to leave completely over to you. So what should be included in the plan rules or the ESOP deed?
Yeah, sure. So with the rules, the idea behind this is basically the company at the start will adopt a scheme which is governed by these rules, and those apply to all your participants, and then your individual employees will be offered to participate into that plan. The rules themselves are basically set out the main mechanics of how the option scheme operates. So we're talking about things like what happens if an employee leaves, how will those options vest, what happens if the company has an exit event, all of those kind of things. And a number of those matters we'll cover sort of later on in the webinar in more detail. But the idea here is that you need to ensure that those plan rules operate how you want them to operate for most of the people that you'll be bringing in on the scheme. Second to the plan rules, you've got an offer letter, and that's basically sent to an employee, and it sets out their specific offer. So how many options are you being offered, and what sets the price of those options? The reason I touch on the rules applying to most people is that you can actually override those rules in your offer letter. So if you've got a particular employee that you wanted to operate slightly differently with, you can override it in that offer letter. But, going to the company admin point, you don't want to be overriding the rules in every single offer you make. So you just sort of need to turn your mind right at the start to how do you want this to operate for most people.
Yeah, absolutely. I always say when people ask, a good ESOP is a simple ESOP. And if you're having to chase up different grants for different employees, it quickly becomes unruly and it takes a lot of time to manage. it's a good point about the liquidity as well. Cool. So moving on, this is a good one too, and probably one of the more the more frequently asked questions that I get, at least, and that's, well, you've set your ESOP up, you've decided how much of the company equity you're going to carve out, you've decided on your plan rules, and now you're ready to actually go out and start issuing ESOP. So the decision-making process around the amount that you are allocating to individual employees. And again, it comes down, it's very horses for courses. So it depends on what the company is trying to achieve and how big the company is. And there's a good indicative scenario in a table, which I'm very happy to share after this, but it varies from, obviously there's, if you almost think of a matrix, there's kind of 3 levels of employee seniority. So you might have like an exec level, so CEO, CFO, COO. You might have sort of a senior leadership role, and that could be, I don't know, a senior developer or HR manager. Then you might have a junior role, so junior developer, EA, that sort of a thing. And so you would structure and bucket sort of the percentages into each of those sorts of demographics, for lack of a better word. And then running side by side to that, you would think about, well, where's the company at? So if it's at the seed round, you would think that shares pound for pound are probably worth less than if you were at, say, Series A, B, C. And so you're more likely as a percentage to allocate a higher amount than you would at those later stages too. I think that's probably the most common. Again, it's very much how generous a company is and how many employees they have. But that's primarily the 2 things that I would encourage people to consider. Is there anything that you can think of there, George, that you would add to that?
I'd just say that generally from a company transparency perspective, you want to make sure that you're offering the employees at the same level, the same sorts of bands, and that you're quite open about that. It shows that you're being fair to your employees, but also it helps you manage things from a company perspective, manage your allocation most effectively. Part of that kind of goes to the consideration of, well, are we going to offer this to all of our employees, or are we only going to offer it to some of our employees? And normally when a client sort of asks me about, which way do I go with that, again, very much dependent on your particular scenario, and there are advantages, disadvantages to both methods. But obviously, if you are offering it to all of your employees, you can potentially blow out quite quickly the number of shareholders on your cap table. And you often need to be a bit more structured in your approach in terms of those bands and the policies in terms of grants, things like that. But you do have all staff incentivized. Whereas on the flip side, if you're only offering it to, your main key employees, then you can be a bit more flexible in your approach with how you structure the plan and how you roll it out going forwards.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that, I think, leads us into the next question that we're asked quite frequently, and that's around vesting. So what vesting structures should be used? And I'll add another question to that for you, Georgina, because it's one that I don't like answering. What is a vesting cliff? So what vesting structures should be used and can be used? And how would you describe a vesting cliff?
Yeah, sure. So with the vesting, and you touched on it earlier, Keegan, there's basically 2 common ways to structure your vesting. And again, the whole idea of vesting is basically you need to earn the right to be issued shares. So the vesting is either or both time-based vesting or performance-based vesting. So those are the conditions that you have to meet to get the right to exercise into shares. The baseline is time only. So the idea is you have to stay with the company in order for your options to vest. It's popular because it's an objective standard, and you can be consistent across all of your employees. You can then add to that an additional condition, which is around, will you actually have to hit these KPIs, and they might be company KPIs or personal KPIs in order for them to vest again. So again, you can structure it how you want. typically we see, and this kind of goes to the cliff point, so typically we see a 4-year vesting period, and you have quarterly or monthly vesting within that 4-year period. That includes a 1-year cliff, which effectively just means that the employee has to stay with the company for a whole year before anything vests. And then their monthly or quarterly vesting over that year effectively catches up. So it all hits at once after the 12-month mark. Recent trend that we're seeing at the moment in New Zealand in particular, and in the kind of tech startup space, is that, it's a very fast-paced, constant change environment. And so I'm more and more often seeing companies opting for a much shorter vesting period, so that 2 to 3 years is becoming more and more common, just because 4 years down the track the company might not necessarily want a particular employee with certain expertise to be incentivized to stay for the whole 4 years, and so we are seeing that trend shift towards shorter vesting periods.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the benefits of having those vesting events closer and closer together, so say monthly or quarterly or even biannually, rather than say once every 12 months, is it encourages the engagement for the employees to interact with their ESOP as well. So it's very easy to sign an options grant on day one when you're just very fresh to the company, and kind of a year later you realize, oh, actually that's right, I wonder what that's doing now. But if you have these vesting events more frequent, then it feels a little bit more tangible and a little bit more real to employees. And so the incentive which you are trying to provide as an employer is perhaps a little bit more effective than it would be otherwise. And I think there's a couple of different schools of thought on what exercise price can be used. I'd love for you to expand on that as best you could, George.
Yeah, sure. So typically for growth companies, you'll see them set the exercise price at the market value of the company at the time that you issue the options. It can be set higher or lower than that amount, but that's normally where you set it. And then it's a matter of managing employee expectations going forward. So as the company grows, the value will increase, and so there'll be an increased price for future offers. What you're communicating to the employee is that, you are being offered options at $1 now. Over that 4-year period, if that's your vesting period, you will then see the value of any increase in value in the company over that 4-year period and onwards until you leave the company. So you're needing them to focus on the increase in value since the time of the exercise. And look, the question that we always get asked, and I'm anticipating this from you, Keegan, is around the tax piece. And look, I can't stress it enough for, go and talk to your accountant. As you're structuring your ESOP and setting it up, make sure you go and talk to your accountant to understand what those tax implications are, both for the company and the employee, of the way that you've structured it. As a company, you're not wanting to give your employees legal or accounting advice, tax advice, but you do want some general understanding to give them some guidance so that they can then go and seek that advice for their own personal situation as well. And sort of, I guess, fleshing out on the tax piece, we can, as a sort of broad brush overview of how it does operate in these situations, which is something that often gets focused on with these for obvious reasons, is that, there's no tax when you're issued the options, but the taxing point in New Zealand is typically when they get exercised. So as soon as you exercise your options into shares, the employee will be taxed on the benefit that they receive. And so that's the difference between the market value at the time that they exercise and the actual exercise price that they pay. But then, later down the track, because there's no capital gains tax in New Zealand, that unless they're buying them to sell or they're seen as a share trader, then they won't get taxed later down the track when there is an exit event or a sale event.
Yeah. The best way I've heard it be described in a really succinct way is you can consider your allocation of share options as tax-free up until the point where you are treated as any other shareholder. And while that's probably riddled with holes from a legal advice perspective, it's a good rule of thumb and a good way to, I guess, get across to employees what their tax obligation may be in the future. But again, just to reiterate it, I'm not a financial advisor, so please seek your own advice on that. And so, absolutely, we've, as an employee, we have joined a really cool startup, and we've been allocated options as part of our remuneration. We've stuck around with the company and hit all the goals that we want to. And, we're now coming up to the point where we've had all of our options vest. And the next question that I'm going to ask as an employee is, well, when can I actually exercise my options? So what would you usually recommend to companies, Georgina?
Yeah, so there's two options here. You can either allow them to exercise as soon as they vest, or only when you have an exit event. So that's something like a share sale, a business sale, or an IPO. Both had advantages and disadvantages. So if you're allowing them to exercise as soon as they vest, then that's often easier to explain to employees, and it helps them kind of feel like they're more in control of the process, more in control as to when they can exercise. On the flip side, only allowing them to exercise on exit is typically more beneficial for the company, because they can then reduce the admin that's involved in terms of having a lot of employees exercising their options frequently, and allows them to minimise basically the number of minority shareholders that they actually have on the cap table. It also comes down to company growth plans. So, if you've got a startup, typically the life cycle is short. They start up on the basis that they want to have an exit quickly, in which case, it makes sense for them to only be allowed to exercise on an exit, because they can actually see that is going to happen. Whereas if you've got a company that's sort of more focused on profit and just general sort of natural growth, no immediate plans to exit, well, then that might be a company that's more sort of suited to allowing employees to exercise as they vest. And I think sort of the one thing to be thinking about is that if you are allowing people to exercise on vesting, there's kind of two key things you need to be thinking about. Is make sure that you've got a shareholders agreement in place before your first employee exercises. So, once they exercise, they've got shares in hand, and effectively the plan rules fall away at that point. So you might want to make sure you build in things like good and bad leaver provisions into your shareholders agreement to then govern them holding them on an ongoing basis. And the other thing is to make sure that your plan rules allow the company to set up basically a trustee structure. The reason that you might want to do that is to basically just streamline your cap table and avoid having lots of minority shareholders. And instead, you just aggregate that holding under a single trustee. And it doesn't mean that on setup you have to set up that nominee structure, but it just gives you the ability to do that later down the track. If, for example, you're kind of sort of butting up to that 50 shareholder mark, which tips you into being a code company, which has all sorts of implications.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head there around having a shareholders agreement in place. If the company is allowing their employees to exercise at the point that it's vesting, then that's a really important thing. And I know Legal Vision provides those services. So I would encourage anyone that wants to structure their ESOP like that to get in touch with you directly, because that's a really important component. Absolutely. Cool. I think that's probably about it for the questions that I've got to throw at you, Georgina. So I guess next steps, if you are thinking about setting up an ESOP, well, what do we do? Well, Orchestra, we provide our own ESOP packages, so we know that it's not exactly easy to set these up, and I have a saying that goes something along the lines of not all ESOPs are created equal, so it's good to get it right on day one. And so as part of our Orchestra ESOP packages, we have a couple of wraparounds that help support an efficient and effective ESOP. First one being a scoping session. That's usually with me, where I would ask a company pretty much the questions that we've covered off today, and based on that, I would introduce obviously you, Georgina, who would have a more formalized consultation. Those documents which are necessary to implement an ESOP would then be drafted. Now, running side by side to that, we also have a great tax advisor, which is included in the Orchestra ESOP packages. And so we put you in front of them, and they talk you through some of those more complicated tax issues, both from a company perspective, but from an employee perspective as well. And then once you have given, I guess, the green light, or you've finalized the documentation from a legal perspective, then those documents come through to us at Orchestra. They come through to the company, and we load it up ready for management, set up the ESOP pools, and get the grants ready to send out to employees. And then, of course, you can manage that yourself through the Orchestra platform. So those are the ESOP packages. And if you are interested in setting one up for your company, I'm usually the best man to talk to about that. So feel free to reach out. Cool. Now, I figure there's probably going to be some pretty meaty questions. So Dave, have we had any come through?
Yeah, we do. So I'll kick into those. Thanks to the people that have submitted the questions. The first one we've got, which I'll probably let you cover, Keegan. In the example company with a 10% ESOP at around, is there an expectation that the 10% allocation is fully allocated before the next round of financing? So that's the pool fully allocated. And then in the next round, the ESOP regrown, so I suppose with the new pool.
Yeah, that's what we would see for the most part. So you might on day one set up an ESOP of say 10%, just because that's the example that we're using. And then you would issue that out to your employees. Obviously, you don't want to do it all on day one because you might be making hires in between your seed and Series A round, and so then you want to kind of keep some in the chamber, is the way I would describe it. So you might find someone who's going to be really intrinsic to the success of your company, and you want to have some ESOP to be able to offer to them. When it comes to the next round, yeah, the expectation both from a company side, an investor side, and then equally an employee side is that you would add further options. You would expand that option pool. Some companies put two pools side by side so they can kind of clearly say, look, this was our seed option pool and this is our Series A option pool. It's much a muchness. It really comes down to how you would like it to be structured.
So if you've got leftover in the initial pool, you can really just top that up, I suppose, as one option.
Yeah, exactly right.
In the next financing round.
Yep.
Based on the expectations, how much you think you'll need to offer employees and for new staff as well between now and the next funding round, really, isn't it?
Yep.
Okay. Excellent. So next question, this one looks primed for George. So it's around the FMCA. So question there, the 10% exemption under the FMCA, they're interested to get some comment on this in respect to the assumption that this percentage is based on the actual allocations to participants as opposed to, say, what's been allocated to the pool.
Yeah, look, that's a really good question, and something that we could have almost a whole webinar on. But it's really good, really important to flag, and it's quite a nice way to sort of tidy all this conversation up. Is that you need to be aware of your disclosure obligations under the FMCA, which is our New Zealand securities law, kind of the main governing act. There is an exemption in there, which obviously this person is asking about, around ESOPs. So it effectively allows companies to offer options to employees without going through the usual really rigorous disclosure requirements, which have pretty big time and cost implications for a company. But there are certain parameters that you need to sit within to make sure that you can rely on that exemption. The first two of those are pretty easy to kind of cover off, I guess, and those require you to offer the options in connection with basically a remuneration package. The second is that the company is not supposed to be trying to make money out of it, which, it's typically never going to be trying to do that with an ESOP. The third one, which is what that question goes to, is this requirement of 10%. So this is different. So that the requirement is that you can't offer more than 10% to your employees in any 12-month period. that's different to what you set aside for your general pool. So you might have a 20% pool set aside. You just need to make sure that within a 12-month period, you're not issuing more than 10% of the share cap at the start of that 12-month period. And it's a rolling 12-month period. So it's just something that you need to keep an eye on and make sure that you're not tipping over that requirement. And, really we would see a company issuing a full 10% in a 1-year period, because as we've touched on, you want to manage how you roll out the ESOP and you don't want to issue it all at once. And again, that's where your Orchestra platform comes in handy, because it's obviously keeping you up to date in real time, and you can make sure that you're not getting close to that upper kind of requirement.
Great, thanks. And then just a second part to that question, how does the 10% work if the ESOP shares are a separate class of shares? So is the 10% measured with reference to total class or across all shares?
Yeah, again, really good question. So it's on a per class basis. So it means that if you've got a voting class and a non-voting class, typically the reason you'd set up a non-voting class is that you've got a whole bunch of employees that you want to bring in on your ESOP, but you don't necessarily want them sitting having voting rights. And so the non-voting class looks really attractive to a company. My response to that is be very careful, because actually that 10% requirement is then only attached to that non-voting class. So if it's only employees under the ESOP that are being issued non-voting shares, suddenly you've got no headroom within that. There are different ways that you can structure it so that you can make sure that the 10% is attached to basically your ordinary share class to give you the most headroom possible. But again, trying to kind of manage, I guess, the ability of those employees to then be involved in company decision-making going forwards. But really good questions and things to be very, very conscious of and have a chat to us about before you set it up.
Yeah, for sure. Great. One more question. This one looks like it's got Keegan's name on it. Does Orchestra's functionality allow for quarterly, monthly vesting? And if so, can it cater for minimum service, e.g. 1 year?
Yeah, short answer is yes, absolutely. The longer answer, if I was to flesh that out, so effectively within Orchestra, there's 3 different ways that we handle vesting, and it covers all situations. So the first one would be you set up a one-off automatic vesting event. So the example of that, which I like to give, is that today I want to set up a vesting event which is going to be triggered for Christmas Day 2022. Now Christmas rolls round, I'm the company admin, I'm sitting having lunch with my family on Christmas Day, and that automatically vests without me having to log into Orchestra. So you set it up today for whenever you want it to vest, and it will automatically vest. That's the first one. Second one is what we consider a more manual based vesting event, and so that obviously requires a little bit more hands-on intervention, and that's usually tied in with KPIs or performance objectives, whether those are team-based or individual-based. You set them up on day one, and then depending on the outcome, you would log in, and there's buttons in Orchestra to either approve or decline that based on the outcome, obviously. And then by and far the most common way that we structure vesting, or we see companies structure vesting within Orchestra, is the regular automatic vesting. And so that's day one, you set it up. So say 1,000 options vesting over 4 years, and you can set that up to be monthly or quarterly or biannually or every 12 months. It's entirely up to you. So you set it up on day one, and it's very much a set and forget solution. It'll tick over without you having to jump on and do anything like you would with a spreadsheet. Cool. I think that's it for questions.
Yeah, that is. But let us know or book a time with Keegan if you've got any specific questions as well. Yeah,
cool. It looks like we have perhaps used up most of our time for today. I thought that might be the case. So we're not going to have time to have a peek under the bonnet of Orchestra. Probably not a bad thing if you are keen to take a look at how we help manage ESOPs. Just please reach out to me directly, and I'll put up our details. So that's me, Keegan, and we can share Georgina's details with you as well. She has very generously offered a 1 month free membership to Legal Vision's Pro membership, which I know firsthand is kind of their platinum tier. So I can share that Georgina's details with those who are interested in that. But yeah, I guess thank you very much, Georgina, for joining us. I know you would have answered a lot of questions which the attendees were asking. So we appreciate your time very much.
A pleasure.
And thanks everyone else for attending too.